Hello everyone, my name is Chrissy and welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing a book review of Cold-Hearted Rake by Kleypas. This is a Regency romance novel that features a character named Devon and a character named Kathleen. Now Devon is a guy who gets an earldom because his cousin Theo breaks his neck in a horse accident. So Devon doesn't actually want an earldom, but he was like, okay, let's look at the property of Eversby Priory and see what I can get out of it or where I can sell it to because I don't want it. And he goes to the property and he ends up meeting Kathleen, who is Theo's widow. Now, Kathleen has been living on Eversby Priory with Theo's sisters, Helen, Cassandra, and Pandora. Cassandra and Pandora are twins, by the way, and they're my favorite characters. When Devon does get there and he starts to try and figure out, what he's going to sell, how he's going to sell the property and get rid of everything and, wash his hands of this whole thing, Kathleen and him get into a bit of a verbal altercation because Kathleen, I think understandably is upset at the idea of this estate going for sale because now she's going to have to figure out where she's going to live. She's going to have to figure out where Theo's sisters live. And she has to think about all the tenants who are on the property as well, who do farming on this estate. If Devon sells it, then a lot of people are out of a place to live and out of work. So they get into a altercation. They decide that they don't like each other, but that they are heavily attracted to one another. So this is the basis of their enemies to lovers way. Eventually, Devon, in the first couple of chapters, decides not to sell Eversby Priory and instead tries to, actually run it like an earl. And then he also comes to the conclusion that Kathleen will be his, or what have you. Kathleen is attracted to him, but she is also trying to manage her stages of mourning, so I guess ladies of that time had to mourn for a certain time period before they could, move along. Devon doesn't care about any of that, by the way. He's just like, let's bang. And Kathleen's like, no. And then eventually they do bang. And there we have it. To talk about the characters first, I wasn't a fan of Devon and I wasn't a fan of Kathleen. Which, I feel like I should have been. There was just something about the two that I just wasn't a big fan of. And I think it's that they were just nasty to each other to be nasty to each other. Like, they had good reason at the beginning because they had a misunderstanding and they said some things that were just not nice to each other, so they fought back with one another verbally. Understandable. But at some point in, the development of their relationship, they're just still not very nice to each other in front of other people. So the only times where you get to really hear them say somewhat nice things is behind closed doors, but if there's another person there, it's like, no. That part, I just wasn't a fan of. In my enemies to lovers romances, if the relationship is starting to progress and feelings are starting to change, I like for attitudes to change, and especially in front of other people. Few exceptions, but that's generally how I like my enemies to lovers plotlines. And this just wasn't following it. Now, the side characters, however, I loved. Helen is Theo's sister, and she's the oldest of the sisters. And she's the sweetest person, and I just liked her character a lot, because she's sweet, but she's also very determined, and she's doing her best. Precious cinnamon roll. Too good for this world. Then there's Pandora and Cassandra, who are twins, who are so funny. They're not heavily socialized among their peers, and so they do some really awkward things that always make Kathleen rub her temples and going where did I go wrong? Why are they doing this? And it's fantastic. I love it. And then there's West, who is also one of my favorite characters, and he is Devon's brother. Now, West had a very similar outlook on things that Devon had at the beginning of the book. He thought that the property should be sold. He also dealt with alcoholism and, was a playboy as well. But when he got into working on Eversby Priory with Devon, he started to change, and I just really liked that progression. He didn't change his core personality. He was still very sarcastic, still very charming when he wanted to be. But he grew as a character, which is what we should strive for. The last character that I'll mention is Mr. Winterbourne. This is Reese Winterbourne. He is a guy who makes a lot of money from running a department store or running a chain of department stores. I think it's a chain, or the beginnings of a chain. He is very, very rich, and he is at one point trying to partner up with Devon as far as like deals go, or something. There's stuff in the air. He's friends with Devon as well. And I liked him at the beginning of the book, or around the middle when he's introduced, and I liked him as a character. But then, at the end of the book, I just wasn't that big of a fan. Like, I was still intrigued by his character, but he was doing some stuff I didn't agree with. Now, I'll get into why I didn't like Mr. Winterbourne by the end later on, but now to get into the plot. And I really loved the history parts of this book. So whenever it got to Devon trying to raise funds for Everbee's Priory, I was really happy about it. I was like, yes, show me how he's gonna get the money. But whenever it went into the relationship aspect of this book, I just wasn't really as on board. As stated, I wasn't really the biggest fan of Devon and Kathleen to begin with. So there's that. And so then when the romance parts came in, I was just like, who cares? Move it along, get back to West. And that, now that I'm thinking about it, that kind of sounds really mean in terms of a romance book. I do think that this book is worth reading. I do think that people should give it a chance because I really liked the other plot lines other than the romance. But yeah, I just wasn't a big fan of the romance. And besides that, the language that was used in those intimate scenes was very euphemism filled. Like, there was like, the body parts just weren't mentioned by their names, and I can understand that choice because sometimes you just don't want to read certain body parts names, and you're just like, ugh, really? You're like, we have to read this 100 times? But at the same time, there's just some parts I was just like, can't you just call it what it is? So I was torn a little bit about that. I ended up just not liking the euphemisms that were used. Now, with Rhys Winterbourne, he and Helen start getting into a type of arranged marriage that Devon's trying to set up. And at one point, Rhys he kisses Helen. And Helen, who has been sheltered for a long period of time, who does not have a lot of experience with anyone, let alone a relationship or physical intimacy, hesitates, she shies away. And Mr. Winterbourne has a, inferiority complex and says she thinks she's too good for him and that she's disgusted by him and yada, 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 yada. And that's the part where I didn't really like Mr. Winterbourne after that because, really? I just felt for Helen. I was hoping that someone would come and, yell at Mr. Winterbourne. And someone somewhat does, but neither here nor there. Someone should yell at him some more. I'm a little bit torn on whether or not to read the next book in this series, which is Marrying Mr. Winterbourne, because when Helen and Mr. Winterbourne's relationship first starts out, I was really invested, and then that whole kissing thing happened, and I just thought, this guy. And so now I'm like, do I read it? Do I not read it? I actually think I will probably give it another try, and we'll go from there. I do want to give a little bit of a warning to people who do pick this book up, is that there were some scenes that I think could be considered dubious consent as far as intimacy goes. It's not terrible, like no one's like forcing themselves on someone else, but there's a scene that gets a little bit too close for my comfort, or even like is on that line to where I'm just like, I don't know about that. And oddly enough, it's Kathleen doing it, not Devon. So bear that in mind. That's my thoughts on Cold Hearted Rake. I liked a lot of what the author was doing as far as outside of the romance. Wasn't a big fan of the romance parts. So I'm going to try out some of her other books and see how I like those. Do you have any suggestions for this author? Like, does she have a series other than this one? As always and forever, thank you so much for watching and giving me a little bit of your time, and may you get lost in the book.